She drove the 17th's lone Firestarter, a venerable FS9H retrofitted with recovered tech gimmicks to nearly the specs of the comparatively new 9S model through Uncle Chandy's un-Kurita-like largesse. Like any mech warrior who piloted the highly specialized and risky-to-operate mech by choice, Ruby was a confirmed pyromaniac of long standing. Black Dragon, page 192, by Victor Milan. In the wake of a civil war and decades of turbulent attempts at political reform, the Lyran Commonwealth had a lot of plates balanced in the air by the mid-26th century. With the Star League not yet formed and dust still unsettled from internal and external conflict, engineers at a company by the name Argyle Technologies, based out of Skye, had an idea that would set the galaxy aflame. Argyle's team sought to create a light mech that broke the mold from other battlemechs in the weight class. Instead of loading it with missiles or a bevy of lasers, they laid down the future of their product at the altar of the often underestimated flamer. The technology for spewing fire onto your enemies dates back thousands of years. Though the mechanics and materials used to accomplish it have changed, the basic principle stayed the same. An enemy that is on fire is much less likely to be able to focus on anything else. The fusion-powered flamers that the Firestarter carried were fueled by venting plasma from the battlemech's reactor. Though often overlooked as being ineffective against armored targets, the effect on softer targets was not in doubt. Even mech-sized machine guns lacked the psychological effect that flamers had on infantry. With the goal of creating a specialized mech which could operate away from conventional forces, either in a scouting or guerrilla-type role, the flamer was perfect for both. This is why they went ahead and put 4 of them on the battlemech. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. The Firestarter was designed to be a nimble 35-ton battlemech which, as previously mentioned, could fill a variety of needs beyond those that could be accomplished by the other mechs in the class. While faster light mechs did exist, few could bring enough firepower into play at their destination to make behind enemy lines actions effective. Built around an in-house produced H09 frame and Omni 210 fusion engine, the top speed of the FS9A Firestarter was just 97 km per hour. It pales in comparison to many of its peers, but as we can all probably rattle off by memory now, opportunity cost spares no one, not even the Firestarter. Luxor load lifter jump jets pushed the jump capacity to 180 meters, and the mech was left with an entirely respectable 696 movement profile. The Firestarter's 4 Purity L-Series flamers were scattered across the mech, 1 in each arm, 2 in the center torso, with 1 facing their rear firing arc. With the mech's name in mind, the flamers did tend to garner a lot of attention, but the primary weaponry really had to be the 2 Magna II medium lasers split between the arms. Multifunctional and reliable, the medium laser's damage couldn't be ignored. I learned this the hard way the other day when my son used his Firestarter to knock off one of my Jenner's legs before kicking my mech to death. I think I may have created a monster. Backing up the lasers and flamers were 2 small lasers split between the side torsos. In total, the Firestarter FS9 was remarkably well armed for a 35-ton battlemech. The costs of that were paid for in the previously mentioned speed, the fair 6.5 tons of standard armor, and having just 10 heat sinks, which made Alpha Strikes a toasty if not reckless choice. We're going to see pretty quickly that even the designers admit they went a little bit too far with the Firestarter's light show. 2 red blips and a green blip appeared 300 meters to the north. Will fired his jump jets and came down in a clearing. At the far side, 2 enemy mechs, a Hatchetman and a Firestarter, were circling Kent's purple Wolverine. The Hatchetman was lunging in close, trying to hit it with its primitive namesake weapon, and the Firestarter was blazing away with its flamers. Will could see Kent's paint peeling away all over. He must be overheating. His mech is shutting down. "Retreat, damn it!" he shouted. "You're going to die!" Up Close, from Shrapnel 11, page 133, by W.T. Brown. The first runs of the Firestarter were gobbled up quickly, many serving in the units of the Lyran Commonwealth. Popular due to its capabilities and very well-chosen name, Argyle ended up producing thousands of Firestarters. Some made it into the hands of the SLDF, and the Firestarter saw action during the Reunification War and battle between Kerensky and Ameris in the darkest days of the Star League's decline. As hinted at earlier, the heat generation for the Firestarter's weapons was quickly identified as an issue for those who used the FS9A model. He was even worse for the FS9K, which was produced by Argyle at the same time as the A variant. It featured a large laser in the arm instead of two mediums and dropped a ton of armor plating. While the large laser on an agile 35-ton mech does sound nice, trying to wrangle it with just 10 single heatsinks significantly limited the battle mech. Just a scant 153 years later, the Firestarter received a slight revamp in an attempt to mitigate some of the mech's heat issues. Based upon the A-config original, it dropped the two small lasers from the side torsos and added two standard machine guns instead. A ton of armor was shaved off to buy enough mass for the single ton of ammunition in the right torso. Though obviously not without its trade-offs in the form of less armor and the opportunity for a machine gun ammo critical hit explosion, the FS9H became the Succession War's standard machine. It became so ubiquitous in its use across the Great Houses that most think of the H rather than the A or K variants when the name Firestarter was mentioned. Coventry Metalworks became the primary manufacturer after Argyle Technologies off Skye was destroyed in the catastrophic battle that rendered the entire city into smoldering debris during the Third Succession War. Thanks to having such a long production run, spare parts for the Firestarter were plentiful, and most machines, even badly damaged ones, could typically be salvaged and returned to the fight. When fielded as a scout, its agility and fair armor were appreciated, as well as the mech's nasty reputation. The mere sight of a Firestarter could strike fear in the hearts of almost any infantryman. Never underestimate the psychological impact that fire has on an enemy. In August of 2786, during a desperate defensive action within a city on the planet Port Mosby, the 2nd Lyran Guards were charged with holding ground against an invading force from the Draconis Combine. When the Dragon's forces approached the capital, Colonel Alexandra Waters put her plan into action, sending a contingent of mech warriors and Firestarters out into the heavily forested terrain. Vastly outnumbered, the Lyrans set the forest aflame around the Combine forces, creating a firestorm which swept across the attackers. Though the battlemechs could withstand the heat, it slowed and then stalled their advance. With their cover blown, the Caretans were forced to retreat. As successful as that defense was, just 1 year later the Combine returned to Port Mosby and eradicated the defending forces. As it turned out, burning all the forests down around the city only works one every 40 to 50 years due to the growth cycle of trees. Go ahead and write that down for later. Very often, Firestarters were assigned to special units or with light lances that could take advantage of the mech's unique firepower. Wasp and Stinger lances often lacked the oomph to capitalize upon their ability to squeak past enemy lines. This was an opportunity for the Firestarter to do its business. If enemy resources could not be captured and returned to friendly forces, often the next best option was to destroy them so they couldn't be used by the enemy. In this venture, it's always nice to have a few flamers around. By the 2890s, Argyle tested a new variant of the Firestarter designated the FS9M. It boldly pulled the flamers from the battlemech, hang on, I know, just stay with me here, and replaced them with two small lasers, an additional heatsink, and 2 additional tons of armor. The Mirage, as it was nicknamed, was only in production for a year before the destruction of the Argyle factory and ended up a pretty rare sight. It's recorded that the Skye Rangers fielded a lance of the FS9M with a unique black arm paint job in tribute to all those who died in the fighting on the Skye. Coming to the suburbs of the city, they encountered the first sign of the 3rd Royals as a platoon of infantry opened up with short-range missiles as they passed. Most of the attack force did not even slow pace. The only mech that broke ranks was a Highlander Firestarter that fired its jump jets and lifted into the air long enough to target the building where the Davion troops were positioned. With a blast from every one of its weapons, the Firestarter wiped the small building off the face of the planet, leaving in its place only billowing black smoke and roaring flames. The Highlander Gambit, page 270 by Blaine Lee Pardoe. With the discovery of the Helm memory core, the race was on to update battlemechs with new weaponry and technology. Due to its popularity with the soldiery, company representatives on Coventry were surprised to see a flood of demands for an updated Firestarter. Not likely to say no to eager customers, Coventry Metalworks got busy with a plan for what would eventually be labeled the FS9S before its release in 3049. An obvious first choice was to swap out to Endosteel and to buy 1.5 tons of mass for use elsewhere. The most obviously needed upgrade, the shift to double heatsinks, was unfortunately ignored. in favor of adding an anti-missile system to the left torso along with 1 ton of ammunition and a Beagle active probe. Additionally, a single small laser sat in the right torso. An alternative sub-variant of the S, appropriately labeled the S1, carried a Guardian ECM instead of the Beagle active probe. Nice to know it's there if you need it. While the S and S1 did extend the life of the mech in the face of missile-based threats, and it made the Firestarter a little bit more efficient of a hunter, it really feels like a missed opportunity for the Helm memory core upgrade. I'd even go so far to say that unless you need a Beagle active probe or a Guardian ECM on your mission, you're probably better off sticking with the A or H variants. At least the 3050 TRO line art is pretty retro cool. Thankfully, the Inner Sphere would only have to wait a scant 7 years for a new Firestarter. However, this new arrival would look drastically different due to several factors. The first was that it was 10 tons heavier and now a medium mech. The next factor was that it was one of the first attempts at creating an Inner Sphere OmniMech. It had its own factory and plenty of variants, so in the interest of keeping this video down to under 3 hours, we're going to save that coverage for another day. For now, we acknowledge that the Firestarter O exists, and that explains why we won't see another standard Firestarter variant until 3064. Andrew Redburn narrowed his eyes as he settled the targeting crosshairs for his Firestarter's twin arm-mounted medium lasers. It was just like they said at Warriors Hall on New Syrtis. Every mech has 2 flaws. One is the designer, who believes he's created an invincible machine, and the other is the pilot, who believes the designer. Archer and Demon Lances, let fly. The 2 Valkyrie Lances released their flights of LRMs while the other 3 Delta Lances raced in beneath the missile umbrella. As the missiles arced overhead, 10 ruby shafts of medium laser fire flashed forward like arrows at 2 of the Goliaths. Warrior, repost. Page 339, by Michael A. Stackpole. By the early 3060s, the Firestarter, particularly the H variant, could be found everywhere across the Inner Sphere and even out into the periphery. When Coventry Metalworks identified an opportunity to capitalize upon new technology and a trend among forces of periphery nations, they took another look at the classic Firestarter. The resulting FS9C variant was built as a hunter-killer battlemech with tremendous one-shot firepower. Let's dive in. The FS9C was rebuilt from the ground up, this time with a standard internal frame. It retained the standard engine but upgraded both the heatsinks to 10 doubles and swapped to 5.5 tons of ferrofibrous armor plating, which offered 98 points of protection. This was a full 10 points more than the Firestarter H. If you need a minute to calm down, I understand, but we're going to keep going. Pause the video and come back to us when you're ready. With the internals sorted, Coventry Metalworks also revamped the weapons loadout. The 2 standard medium lasers were retained, as well as 2 flamers, each split between the left and right arms. From here, it starts to get a little bit wild, with 4 rocket launcher 10 packs that were added to the left and center torso, and 2 more rocket launcher 15s were added to the right torso. For the uninitiated, rocket launchers are single-shot weapons with a +1 penalty to their accuracy. They still use the missile hit table for damage in clusters of 5, but the damage potential if the dice gods are on your side is substantial. The potential 70 damage in rockets alone has the Firestarter 9C hitting way above its weight, at least once. Thanks to the double heatsinks, it can even potentially survive that Alpha Strike killshot. Firing all of the rockets at once adds 20 heat, which would set the mech at +2 into the red while on the run. Tossing in the 2 medium lasers for a potential 10 additional damage would push that to +8, which is concerning but not scary. It's really nice to see the double heatsinks on the Firestarter for the first time. It really needed them. The downside for the FS9C is that those rocket launchers really make an already niche case use battlemech even more so. While perfectly serviceable and absolutely a threat not to be ignored, I find myself wanting something else. So let's see what the rest of the 3060s has to offer. 3064 was a banner year for the Firestarter, as the C was joined by the FS9P variant, which would end up being the battlemech that fans of the design wanted 20 years earlier. It was apparently designed to meet the specifications of buyers within the Circinus Federation who wanted a battlemech that could spread fear and fire. Constructed with endosteel, the usual standard engine is there in place along with the jump jets to maintain the 696 movement profile. All good so far. 10 double heatsinks offered the tantalizing prospect of keeping the mech cool but surprisingly, a half ton of armor was shaved off from the design, leaving it with just 5 tons or 80 points of protection. The loadout for the Firestarter 9P looks a lot like the original A configuration, with 2 medium lasers split between the arms and 2 small lasers split between the side torsos. 4 flamers are scattered across the mech's side torsos and arms as well. All front-facing now, by the way. The last addition to the mech was a pair of short-range missile 2 racks split between the side torsos and fed by a single ton of ammunition in the center torso. Longtime fans of the channel can predict exactly the type of ammunition I would put in this mech. And as it turns out, the Circinus Federation tended to be of like mind. It was very common to see the Firestarter 9P spewing missiles packed with Inferno Gel to supplement the conflagration. At this point in the timeline, this is about as good as we're going to get for an ideal Firestarter. It has the damage potential thanks to the flamer's ability to do that damage or generate heat, and then the 10 double heat sinks allow the mech to fire all of its weapons while on the run and only end up at 6+ into the red. While that does slow the mech the next turn, it's not make or break. In normal use, this Firestarter would be a menace to heavier mechs that let it into the backfield. If you haven't had an opportunity to run this variant, I would suggest it, preferably against your friend's finely tuned laser boat heavy or assault mech. In 3070, the Word of Blake saw the potential in this walking war crime that is the Firestarter by commissioning their own variant labeled the FS9B. It benefited from Endosteel 5.5 tons of light ferrofibrous armor and saw the mech's first installation of a light fusion engine. It also pushed the Firestarter to new heights with the installation of improved jump jets, which shifted the movement profile to 698. Unfortunately, with the installation of the weaponry and equipment, there weren't enough open critical locations for double heatsinks, so the 9B just has 10 singles. The 3 flamers on the mech are no surprise. One was placed into the left arm while the other 2 were installed into the center torso, one of which faced that rear firing arc. An ER medium laser was added to the right arm to give the mech a little bit more punch, and finally an improved C3 computer was installed into the left torso. Overall, the 9B is an agile and fun mech, though some might take issue with the lack of punch from its modest weapons loadout. The 10 single heatsinks are not fun to see, though it's clear from the lack of criticals why it had to go that way. If I were to tweak the design, I would shed the light ferrofibrous armor, and that hardly impacts the overall total protection, and it would open up enough critical slots for the double heatsinks. But I don't get paid by CGL, and I don't make such decisions. Alan Vow sat in the cockpit of his Firestarter, grumbling to himself about the weather, the heat, the mission, and life in general. The young trooper did not realize how lucky he was. One of the often overlooked features of the FS9 series of mechs was the ingress-egress hatch. Where on most mechs the hatch either swung horizontally like a door or slid open on runners, the hatch on the Firestarter hinged upward like the liftgate on a ground car. In rainy conditions, which would normally preclude the opening of a mech's hatch, the Firestarter's accessway could be locked in the up position, affording the pilot with some welcome fresh air. The Hunters, Twilight of the Clans, Volume 3, page 160 by Thomas S. Gressman. Hopping down the timeline a bit to 3074, the FS9X81 project was Defiance Industries' attempt to make a high-tech variant of the Firestarter which could break down targets as well as bust the bank accounts of wealthy buyers. After some Capellan-made plasma rifles fell off the back of a truck and ended up in Defiance hands, designers sought a way to add the fiery weapon to the Firestarter 9H chassis. Needing to buy a significant amount of mass for the design, the standard 210 fusion engine was removed and replaced with an XXL version. While this only weighed 3 tons, it dominated the mech's internal locations with 6 critical spots in each side torso. 5.5 tons of standard plate armor protected the 81X, and it carried 10 double heatsinks. As far as weaponry goes, the previously mentioned plasma rifle was added to the right arm along with 1 ton of ammunition. Joining it in that arm was a medium X pulse laser, and a second laser was added to the left arm as well. 3 flamers were there, 2 in the center torso and 1 in the left arm. One of those CT flamers aimed toward the rear firing arc. The 10 double heatsinks were essential as the plasma rifle generated 10 heat per shot, and each of the X pulse lasers generated 6. Ignoring the flamers for a moment, that's 4+ into the red while on the run. With a possible 9 additional heat if the flamers are brought into play, decisions have to be made. As it turned out, this prototype design was rife with issues, as the size of the plasma rifle and the jerry-rigged frame did not play well together. Even though considerable effort was put into fixing it, targeting issues just plagued the design. Ultimately, the extreme cost, over 16 million C-bills going by Megamech's estimate, and persistent issues for the mech left the Firestarter FS9-81X without a future. Once again, the XXL engine has gone too far. Fox-Lance, led by Hugh de Payens in a Firestarter, attacked the first Goliath to complete the turn and engage Delta Company head-on. As Hugh closed, 2 of his 3 flamers bathed the large mech in orange fire. The Goliath pilot cranked his PPC muzzle down, releasing a savage bolt of blue lightning that stabbed the left side of the Firestarter's chest. Armor peeled off like butter rolling up a knife, but it failed to fully breach the Firestarter's armor. Warrior Repost, page 340 by Michael A. Stackpole. By 3075, the FS9S2 was released, which returned to form with a more traditional loadout. It still benefited from endosteel, the 10 double heat sinks, and 5.5 tons of light ferrofibrous armor. The loadout is basically the same as the S, with 4 flamers, a small laser, Beagle active probe, and an anti-missile system. But the 2 medium lasers were upgraded to the ER variety. That's it. It's not bad to see some range on those medium lasers, but this is not shattering the mold. It's good. Give it a try. Now gird your loins, because the same year the FS9S3 was also released, which mirrored the S1 from 3049. If you predict that it will look exactly the same except for the swap to ER medium lasers, you would be correct. Wow, this is easy. Well, except that now I have to make a mech detail card for this thing so that I can show it on the screen for as long as it took to read the last 3 sentences, including this one, and this one, and this one. Well, let's just move on. That's it for the 31st century, so while the Inner Sphere descended into chaos, a dark age, and then the promise of calm with the Republic of the Sphere, the Firestarter endured. In 3101, the M series of Firestarters from Coventry got a new look with the FS9M2. This update didn't go overboard with the new tech, as it still had a standard fusion engine, but it did have 11 double heatsinks, which is great, and 7 tons of standard plate armor, and it made this Firestarter a tougher cookie in a brawl. The M2's weapons loadout is unique, featuring 6 flamers split evenly between the arms and backed by a single ER medium laser located in the mech's head. While perhaps not as intimidating as earlier variants, the M2 is shockingly heat efficient. A full alpha strike while on the run left the mech at just +3 into the red. Overall, it's an interesting take on the Firestarter with a little bit of a nudge towards defensive than offensive power, but not excessively so. I give the FS9M2 4 very warm beanie frogs on fire. 3 years later, in 3104, the M3 variant stomped onto the scene with the first showing of a mask system, which could push the mech's movement speed up to a temporary 612.6. It benefited from 10 double heat sinks and 7.5 tons of standard armor, which maxes out how much the 35-ton mech can carry. For weaponry, 3 flamers were retained and put together in the right arm, and that ER medium laser is still in the head for some reason. I don't know, it's cool there. Maybe the proximity makes the heart grow fonder. An ER small laser was added to the left arm to create the illusion of balance, and finally, a target acquisition gear was added to the right torso to allow the M3 to act as a spotter for artillery fire. The heat curve for the M3 is great, even if the damage output is not as impressive as with some earlier variants. If you're running an Aero 4 unit and need a spotter, the Firestarter M3 is a durable pick. Now, if you thought the FS9M4 would be more of the same from the previous entries in the M series, you would be wildly incorrect. Besides the addition of an XL engine, it carried a hefty Rotary AC2 autocannon in its right arm, fed by a single ton of ammunition in the left torso. It had 10 double heat sinks, but doesn't need them because this mech runs a very cool. With 3 flamers in the right arm, that's it for this build, which feels a little bit to me like a comparatively cheap defensive unit for a centralized location if you didn't have heavier mechs like the riflemen around. Its large lasers drilled emerald lances into the guts of one Battlehawk, cutting at the supports to the massive gyroscope needed to keep the 30-ton mech on its feet. The Hawk stumbled but kept to its feet, though without a doubt it was hurt. It might have made its escape, then, except for 2 Firestarters setting upon it and pumping fusion-powered flame sources deep into its interior. The plasma-induced flames scorched out the last of the gyro housing. The Battlehawk's cockpit blew away on special charges, and the pilot's couch rocketed out and up on thrusters designed to lift a Mechwarrior clear of a battlefield. Flashpoint, page 103, by Lauren L. Coleman. Our last official variant of the Firestarter came to us in 3143 from Defiance Industries, who got themselves into a legal battle with Coventry Metalworks over the design. While lawyers wrangled over the FS9M Mirage II designation, Defiance went ahead with production of this advanced tech reimagining of the BattleMech. The FS9N utilized an endocomposite frame construction and found further mass savings with an upgrade to a ClanTech 210 XL Fusion engine. Always nice when you have a few of those laying around, right? With that investment in place, the movement profile was retained at the typical 696, and it carried 11 double heatsinks. Things start really getting interesting with the addition of 7.5 tons of reflective armor, which made the mech stronger against energy weapon attacks, but at the cost of both internal critical locations and increased vulnerability to ballistic impacts. Opportunity cost is a cruel mistress. As far as weaponry goes, the Mirage II added a mid-range brawler to its resume with 2 ClanTech ER medium lasers, split between the arms, and a Clan plasma cannon in the center torso, fed by a single ton of ammunition in the right torso. 2 standard flamers were split between the arms, and a third filled the last open critical in the center torso facing the rear firing arc. Finally, 2 ClanTech ER small lasers were split between the left and right torsos. The build definitely plays on the pedigree of previous Firestarters, just with much better technology. The plasma cannon is an interesting wildcard weapon which can be brutally effective against infantry and unarmored vehicles, and even represents a threat to battlemechs if it plays a little bit too fast and loose with their heat buildup in battle. The damage output from the 9N is impressive thanks to the Clan lasers, and the 11 double heatsinks are adequate for general but not heavy firing. The reflective armor makes the mech an automatically more niche option, but for light battle mechs that fear the accuracy of pulse lasers in the 32nd century, it does actually make a lot of sense. The Firestarter FS9N Mirage II is a beautiful battle mech, and one of those machines which I think would be a great way for players to dip their toes into the IlClan era tabletop. It hasn't gone crazy with a bunch of new technology rules, but does really highlight the advantages of reflective armor. It also demonstrates the meshing of clan and inner sphere technology that we can continue to expect from future variants. If you have an opportunity to try out the Mirage II, I'd recommend it. Now, we couldn't possibly go without feeding my insatiable need for attention with a Mechfrog non-cannon variant, so here we go. We're going to start with a light fusion engine, but it's going to be aided by a supercharger in the center torso to boost the 696 movement profile up to a 612.6. Why? Because fireballs should move quickly. In order to cram in the endosteel and 6.5 tons of reflective armor criticals, we also needed to install a compact gyro. This cost us a little mass, but we're going to need enough room for an 11th double heatsink. The jump jets are there, of course, and the remaining mass was dedicated to some modest weaponry. The most powerful and accurate weapon being a medium pulse laser in the left arm to make other light mechs wary of getting too brave and thinking that they can dance. Starting at 7 hexes, 2 ER flamers come into play, offering their 2 damage or heat generation to the target at the cost of 4 heat to the user. Moving closer to the victim or target, an emotional support ER small laser could be brought into play from its head-mounted position. Finally, at hugging range, 2 standard flamers split between the arms could join the fun. The heat generation for the Firestarter MF is within design tolerances, as you can alpha strike while on the run and still end up at net zero heat. If jumping, things can get slightly toasty, but overall this is a Firestarter that runs remarkably cool while ruining the days of others if allowed to get close, which it likely will due to the supercharged 12 run speed. The reflective armor is neat and, as mentioned before, mitigates the threat of pulse lasers a bit, extending the life of this wily light mech. While not putting up massive numbers, I do think this build would be fun to play and could be a problem for heavier mechs that think they're going to take down light mechs like these quickly. While individually the heat added from all 4 flamers is just a potential 8, that could be enough to hobble an opponent's well-laid plans. If you want to give it a shot, I've included the record sheet for it in the video notes below. So why do we love the Firestarter? Besides its obvious appeal as a walking and leaping war crime, the atypical nature of the BattleMech lent itself to those who wanted to tip the tables on a foe expecting the norm of missile launchers and PPC blasts. While it doesn't show up in a lot of BattleTech novels, when it does, the Firestarter tends to be memorable. I'm looking forward to seeing more painted up Firestarters on tables and social media as people dig into their Kickstarter boxes. Even though it has a scary number of poorly placed mold lines, it's still pretty fun to paint after you clean it up. What are your thoughts on the Firestarter? Is it the bee's knees or even the bane of your tabletop existence? Is there a variant that you think is peak Firestarter, or are all of them a little bit of a delightful mess? Let me know in the comments and we'll keep the discussion going. Should I get the Firestarter OmniMech video going next? I suppose I have all the art for it already done. Something to ponder. Thank you as always for coming out today to play in the BattleTech universe with this little fiery monster. Another big thank you to Locust Labs for sharing her 3D rendered Firestarters to class up the video a bit. I've included a link to her Patreon in the video notes below if you're interested in seeing her other work. If you haven't already, hitting that like or subscribe button will make sure the YouTube algorithm is happy, and as a result, you'll be much more likely to see my nonsense in the future. Going the extra step and becoming a channel member or supporting on KoFi will go a long way to make sure I can keep this venture going. I really appreciate it and the opportunity to do my part to support the BattleTech fandom. With that, I'll say goodbye, please stay positive, and go out and make the world a slightly better place today and tomorrow.